The stars looked different through the viewport of the frontier's edge. Jake Morrison stood in the engine room, checking the readings on his display screen. Everything showed green. The ship hummed with steady power as it moved through the darkness of space. He had been on this mission for 6 months now, and the routine had become comfortable, maybe too comfortable. Jake wiped his hands on a cloth and glanced at the photo taped to his workstation. Sophie smiled back at him, holding Katie in her arms. His daughter would turn 8 next month. He had promised to be home for her birthday. The thought made him smile even though he knew promises in space were hard to keep. The communication system crackled to life. Captain Lisa Hammond's voice came through clear and urgent. All crew members needed to report to their stations immediately. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Lisa never sounded like that unless something was wrong. He moved quickly through the corridor, his boots making soft thuds against the metal floor. When he reached the bridge, the tension hit him like a wall. The crew stared at their screens with worried faces. Lisa stood in the center, her jaw tight. She pointed at the main display where a massive shape appeared on their sensors. The ship was enormous, at least 3 times the size of the frontier's edge. It had appeared from nowhere, as if it had been waiting for them. A Zarkonian battlecruiser. Jake had heard stories about them but never seen one. The aliens were known across this part of space for their cruelty. They believed other species were beneath them, tools to be used or destroyed. Humanity had tried to avoid them, but space was vast and encounters were bound to happen eventually. Lisa ordered evasive maneuvers. The pilot pushed the engines to maximum power, but it was already too late. A bright blue pulse shot from the Zarkonian ship and hit them square in the center. Every system on the frontier's edge went dark for 3 seconds. When the lights came back on, half their controls were dead. The engines sputtered and failed. They were floating dead in space. Jake ran back to engineering, his mind racing through possible solutions. He needed to get the engines back online. His hands moved fast over the control panels, rerouting power and bypassing damaged circuits. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of metal screeching. They were being boarded. Lisa's voice came through the speakers again. She ordered all personnel to destroy sensitive data. They could not let the Zarkonians learn about Earth's defenses or the location of human colonies. Jake understood immediately. He pulled up the main computer core and started the deletion process. Years of exploration data, navigation charts, and communication codes began disappearing from the system. The sounds of fighting grew louder. Weapons fire echoed through the corridors. Jake heard screams and shouts. His crew was fighting hard, but they were outnumbered. He forced himself to focus on the task. The data had to be destroyed completely. No fragments, no recovery possible. An explosion rocked the ship. Jake grabbed the wall to steady himself. He looked at the reactor controls and made a decision. If he set the reactor to overload on a timer, the ship would explode after everyone evacuated. The Zarkonians would get nothing. His fingers flew across the keys, entering the commands. 30 minutes. That would give his crew enough time to reach the escape pods. He activated the ship-wide communication system. His voice was calm despite the chaos around him. The reactor was set to blow in 30 minutes. All crew members needed to get to the escape pods immediately. This was not a drill. He heard acknowledgments coming back from different sections of the ship. Jake stayed at his station, making sure the deletion process completed. The percentage climbed slowly. 80%. 85%. The door to engineering burst open. 3 alien soldiers stood there, their weapons raised. They were tall and covered in dark armor that seemed to absorb light. Their faces were hidden behind helmets, but Jake could see their eyes through the visors. Cold, calculating, angry. One of them spoke in broken English, demanding he stop what he was doing. Jake looked at the screen. 92%. He needed more time. He raised his hand slowly, pretending to surrender. The soldier moved closer, weapon still aimed at Jake's chest. 95%. Jake shifted his weight, ready to fight if needed. 98%. The soldier grabbed Jake's shoulder and tried to pull him away from the console. Jake twisted and drove his elbow into the alien's midsection. The armor was hard, but the soldier stumbled back, surprised. 100%. The data was gone. Jake smiled. The other 2 soldiers rushed forward. Jake fought them, but there were too many. A weapon butt cracked against his skull and everything went fuzzy. He fell to his knees, tasting blood in his mouth. Through blurred vision, he saw the timer counting down. 23 minutes until the reactor exploded. The soldiers dragged him through the corridors. He caught glimpses of the destruction, scorch marks on the walls, bodies of his crew members. Some were being herded towards Zarkonian transport pods. Others lay still. Jake felt rage building in his chest, but he kept it controlled. Getting angry would not help anyone now. They threw him into a small transport ship with several other prisoners. None of them were human. Jake saw species he had never encountered before, all looking defeated and scared. The transport launched just as the timer hit 0. Through a small window, Jake watched the frontier's edge explode in a brilliant flash of light. The Zarkonian battlecruiser moved away quickly, avoiding the debris. The transport docked inside the massive alien ship. Jake and the other prisoners were pulled out and marched through cold metal hallways. The ship was huge inside, with ceilings that stretched high above. Zarkonian soldiers watched them pass, their expressions showing nothing but contempt. Jake memorized every turn, every door, every detail. Information was survival. They reached a detention block. Each prisoner was shoved into a separate cell. Jake's cell was barely large enough to stand in. The walls were made of some smooth metal that felt cold to the touch. A shimmering force field covered the entrance, crackling occasionally with blue energy. A single light panel in the ceiling provided dim illumination. Jake sat on the floor and leaned against the wall. His head throbbed where they had hit him. Blood had dried on his temple. He closed his eyes and took several deep breaths. The situation was bad, but he was alive. As long as he was alive, he could fight back. He just needed to be smart about it. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time was hard to measure in the cell. Occasionally, a guard would pass by, looking at him through the force field like he was an animal in a zoo. Jake stared back, refusing to look away first. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes. Finally, a different alien appeared. This one wore no armor, just a dark uniform with symbols Jake did not recognize. The alien was tall and thin, with pale skin and eyes that seemed too large for its face. It studied Jake for a long moment before speaking in perfect English. Its voice was smooth and cold. The alien introduced itself as Commander Vexillar, head of intelligence for the Zarkonian fleet. Jake was a very interesting specimen, Vexillar said. The first human the Zarkonians had captured alive. There were many questions that needed answers. Jake said nothing. He just stared at the commander with steady eyes. Vexillar smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. They would talk again soon, the alien promised. Very soon. The commander walked away, leaving Jake alone in the darkness once more. The interrogation began the next morning, though Jake had no way to know if it was actually morning. Time had no meaning in the cell. 2 guards came and dragged him down several corridors to a large room. The room was empty except for a single chair in the center. They strapped him into it, securing his arms and legs with metal restraints. Vexillar entered the room, followed by 3 other Zarkonians in similar uniforms. The commander walked around Jake slowly, studying him from every angle. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped. Jake felt the cold seeping into his bones. His breath came out in white clouds. The Zarkonians watched him carefully, waiting for him to break. Jake had grown up in Alaska. He had spent winters camping in negative temperatures. This was uncomfortable, but it was nothing he could not handle. He controlled his breathing and kept his face calm. After an hour, he saw confusion in their eyes. They had expected him to be begging by now. Most species did, Vexillar explained. Humans were proving to be different. The temperature suddenly reversed. Heat flooded the room. It felt like standing next to an oven. Sweat poured down Jake's face. His throat became dry. But he had worked in the engine rooms of ships where the heat was even worse. He had trained in deserts where the sun could kill. He closed his eyes and thought of Katie playing in the summer heat back home. The memory gave him strength. Hours passed. The Zarkonians alternated between extreme cold and extreme heat. Jake's body adapted. His mind stayed focused. He ran through engineering problems in his head, calculating complex equations to keep himself sharp. He recalled entire sections of technical manuals he had memorized during his training. The aliens grew more frustrated with each passing hour. Vexillar finally ordered the guards to take Jake back to his cell. The commander seemed puzzled more than angry. They would try different methods tomorrow, Vexillar said. Jake did not respond. He knew this was just the beginning. They would escalate. They would get worse. He needed to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. The next session started differently. They did not use temperature this time. Instead, they kept him awake. Bright lights flooded his cell. Loud noises blasted through speakers. Every time Jake started to drift toward sleep, cold water sprayed on his face. The guards rotated in shifts, making sure he never had a moment of rest. Jake had been trained for this. During his military service, he had gone through survival school. They had taught him techniques for dealing with sleep deprivation. He knew the hallucinations would start after a few days. He knew his mind would play tricks on him. The key was to recognize what was real and what was not. He counted prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13. The pattern was soothing. When he lost track, he started over. He mentally redesigned the frontier's edge, fixing all the small problems that had bothered him. He imagined building a house for Sophie and Katie, planning every detail from the foundation to the roof. His mind stayed active even as his body begged for rest. On the fourth day without sleep, Vexillar came to observe. The commander stood outside the cell, watching Jake with those large, cold eyes. Most prisoners were incoherent by this point, Vexillar said. They babbled and screamed and begged for mercy. But Jake sat quietly, his eyes open but focused on something far away. The commander left looking troubled. They finally let him sleep after 6 days. Jake collapsed on the cell floor and fell into darkness. When he woke up, he had no idea how much time had passed. His body ached everywhere. His head felt like it was filled with cotton, but he was still himself. He had not broken. He had not given them anything. The third method was pain. They took him back to the interrogation room and attached small devices to his skin. When they activated the devices, agony shot through his nervous system. It felt like every nerve in his body was on fire. Jake screamed. He could not help it. The pain was beyond anything he had experienced. But between the waves of pain, Jake used a mental technique he had learned years ago. He imagined putting the pain in a box. The box was separate from him. The pain was real, but it did not define him. He was more than the pain. He was a father, a husband, an engineer. He was a human being from Earth, and humans knew how to endure. Vexillar asked questions during the pain sessions. Where was Earth? How many ships did humanity have? What were their weapons capabilities? Jake said nothing. Sometimes he recited poetry his mother had taught him as a child. Sometimes he sang old songs under his breath. Anything to keep his mind away from what they wanted. The sessions continued for weeks. The Zarkonians tried every physical method they knew. They used drugs that were supposed to make him compliant. Jake's body rejected most of them, making him sick but not cooperative. They tried starvation, but humans could survive longer without food than most species. They tried isolation, but Jake had learned to be comfortable with his own thoughts. Then Vexillar changed tactics. The commander brought a screen into the interrogation room and showed Jake footage. Cities burning, people screaming, soldiers fighting and dying. This is Earth, Vexillar said. This is happening right now. Your planet is under attack. Your family is dead. Your resistance is meaningless. Jake studied the footage carefully. It was fake. He could tell because he knew Earth too well. The buildings in the video were wrong. The architecture did not match any city he recognized. The sun's angle was incorrect. The military vehicles were models that had never been built. The Zarkonians had created this from their imagination, not from real knowledge. This realization was important. It meant the Zarkonians did not actually know where Earth was. They did not have real intelligence about human defenses. They were fishing for information, trying to scare him into revealing what they wanted to know. Jake almost smiled but caught himself. He could not let them see that he understood their weakness. Vexillar showed him more fake footage. Your crew is dead, the commander said. They were captured and executed one by one. You are alone. No one is coming to save you. Jake knew this might actually be true. His crew could be dead, but he also knew that some had made it to the escape pods. Lisa would have sent a distress signal. Earth would know something had happened. The psychological attacks continued for another month. They told him he had been forgotten. They said humanity had abandoned him. They claimed Earth had been destroyed and there was nothing left to go home to. Jake listened to it all with the same calm expression. He never confirmed or denied anything. He simply existed, refusing to give them satisfaction. Finally, Vexillar tried complete isolation. Jake was left alone in his cell with no light, No sound, no contact with anyone. The darkness was absolute. The silence was crushing. Days passed, maybe weeks. Jake lost track of time completely. This was supposed to drive him insane. Most species could not handle the isolation. Their minds broke down without external stimulation, but humans had evolved as social creatures with rich inner lives. Jake talked to himself. He had conversations with imagined versions of his crew members. He debated engineering problems with phantom colleagues. He told stories to an invisible Katie, making up adventures to entertain the daughter who was not there. His imagination kept him company when reality offered nothing. When they finally turned the lights back on, Jake was still sane. Thinner, weaker but unbroken. Vexlar stared at him through the force field with something that looked like fear. The commander had never seen anything like this. In their entire database of interrogations spanning hundreds of species, no one had resisted this long. No one had endured every method without breaking. Jake looked back at the commander with steady eyes. He saw the doubt in Vexlar's face. The Zarkonians were starting to realize that they had underestimated humanity. They had thought humans were just another weak species to be dominated. But they were wrong, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. Jake started paying closer attention to everything around him. Each time guards moved him between his cell and the interrogation rooms, he memorized the route. He counted doors and noted where corridors intersected. He observed which sections had more security and which seemed neglected. The Zarkonians were sloppy. Their confidence had made them careless. The guards themselves revealed much through their behavior. They rotated shifts every 8 hours, but the timing was irregular. Sometimes shifts changed early, sometimes late. This suggested poor coordination. Jake also noticed tension between guards of different ranks. Lower-ranking soldiers showed resentment toward their officers. The Empire maintained control through fear, not loyalty. During one transport through the ship, Jake passed a viewport that showed other vessels docked nearby. Many of them looked damaged or poorly maintained. Repair work seemed slow and inefficient. Supply crates sat abandoned in corridors. Equipment failures went unfixed for days. The mighty Zarkonian Empire was stretched thin, holding together more through reputation than actual strength. Jake decided to change his approach. Instead of remaining silent, he would talk, but he would control what he said. During his next session with Vexlar, Jake spoke freely about human history. He told stories of wars and conflicts that humanity had survived. He described how humans had fought each other for thousands of years, learning and adapting with each generation. Vexlar listened carefully, thinking Jake was finally breaking. But the commander slowly began to understand that these were not confessions of weakness. They were warnings. Jake talked about how empires throughout human history had fallen when they became too confident. He mentioned guerrilla warfare, resistance movements, and how determined underdogs had defeated superior forces countless times. The message was subtle but clear. Humanity would not submit. They would fight with every tool available. They would find weaknesses and exploit them. They would never stop coming. Jake delivered this message while appearing cooperative, making it seem like casual conversation rather than deliberate psychological warfare. Vexlar began showing signs of concern. The commander increased security around Jake's cell, posting extra guards. But this decision revealed fear. The entire crew started looking at the human prisoner differently. If their intelligence commander considered one unarmed human dangerous enough to warrant special precautions, what did that say about the human species as a whole? Jake noticed other prisoners during his movements through the ship. They belonged to various alien species, all looking broken and hopeless. But there was one species that caught his attention. They were shorter than the Zarkonians, with green-tinted skin and large eyes. They worked as maintenance crews throughout the ship. Jake had seen them everywhere, usually ignored by the guards. One day, a member of this species came to repair something near Jake's cell. The being worked slowly, taking longer than necessary. Jake watched quietly, sensing an opportunity. When the guards moved away briefly, the alien spoke in broken English. His name was Zix. His people were called the Keleth. They had been conquered by the Zarkonians decades ago. Zix had been listening to rumors about the human prisoner who could not be broken. The story had spread throughout the ship's lower ranks. Many of the subjugated species working on the vessel had taken hope from it. If one human could resist the Zarkonians, maybe others could as well. Maybe rebellion was possible. Jake asked careful questions. How many Keleth worked on this ship? Were there other conquered species in the crew? Did they have access to critical systems? Zix answered quietly, glancing around to make sure no guards were watching. There were over 200 Keleth on the Eternal Dominance. At least a dozen other species worked here too. Together they outnumbered the Zarkonian soldiers. The maintenance workers had access to almost everything. They repaired life support, fixed engines, maintained weapon systems. The Zarkonians considered them too beaten down to be dangerous. No one paid attention to the workers moving through the ship. They were invisible, which made them powerful if they chose to act. Jake spoke quietly but firmly. The Zarkonians were vulnerable. Their empire was crumbling. But they needed a spark, something to show that resistance was possible. If the Keleth helped Jake escape, he could prove that the Dominion could be defeated, and humanity would remember who helped them. Earth would support the Keleth rebellion. Zix looked terrified but also hopeful. He asked if Jake was serious. Could humanity really help them? Jake looked him straight in the eyes and promised that if they worked together, both their peoples would be free. The Zarkonians had made the mistake of pushing too far. They had created enemies where they could have had neutral neighbors. That mistake would be their downfall. Over the following days, Zix visited whenever possible. He brought Jake small items hidden in his toolkit. A communication device no bigger than a fingernail. Nutrient bars to help Jake regain his strength. Information about the ship's layout and security protocols. Each visit was brief and carefully timed to avoid suspicion. Through the tiny communicator, Jake began coordinating with other Keleth workers throughout the ship. They formed a network, passing messages through their maintenance duties. Jake learned that several other species were willing to join if they believed success was possible. Everyone was tired of Zarkonian cruelty. They just needed leadership and a plan. Jake designed a multi-stage escape plan. The beauty of it was its simplicity. The workers would create false emergencies in different parts of the ship. Nothing that would actually damage anything important, but enough to pull security forces away from the detention area. During the confusion, Zix would disable Jake's cell and guide him through maintenance corridors that the guards rarely monitored. But Jake had a bigger goal than just escaping. He wanted to free all the prisoners and take control of the ship. It was an ambitious plan, maybe even crazy, but he had learned something during his captivity. The Zarkonians ruled through fear because they lacked the actual strength to maintain real control. Take away the fear, show that they could be defeated and their power would collapse. The plan required perfect timing. Everyone had to play their part exactly right. One mistake would mean death for all of them. But the alternative was to remain prisoners forever, or die slowly in Zarkonian captivity. Jake had survived their worst torture. He had endured their psychological attacks. He had proven that humans could not be broken. Now it was time to prove that humans could fight back. Zix asked when they should act. Jake looked at the maintenance worker and saw courage growing in those large eyes. Soon, Jake said, very soon. They needed to prepare more allies and gather more intelligence. But the moment was coming. The Zarkonians had tried to break a human prisoner. Soon they would learn what happens when humans break free. Vexlar visited Jake's cell one more time before the plan was set in motion. The commander studied him with those cold eyes, trying to understand what made humans different. Vexlar asked if Jake had any final words, any information he wanted to share before the interrogations resumed with even more intensity. Jake smiled for the first time since his capture. He looked at Vexlar and spoke clearly. Humans have a saying, Jake said. You should have killed me when you had the chance. The commander did not understand the statement. Vexlar left the cell confused and disturbed. But soon, very soon, the meaning would become perfectly clear. The day came without warning. Jake woke to the sound of alarms echoing through the ship. Not his planned alarms, but something else. Zix appeared at his cell earlier than expected, looking panicked. The Zarkonians had discovered one of their communication devices. They were beginning a security sweep. If they waited any longer, the whole plan would be exposed. Jake made a split-second decision. They would move now, even though not everything was in place. Zix disabled the force field on Jake's cell. The shimmer of blue energy faded and died. Jake stepped out into the corridor for the first time in months as a free man. His legs were weak, but adrenaline gave him strength. Zix handed him a small toolkit. Inside were a few basic tools and one improvised weapon. A metal rod sharpened to a point. Not much, but better than nothing. They moved quickly through the maintenance corridors, staying away from main hallways where guards patrolled. The ship's alarm continued wailing, but it was not for Jake yet. The Zarkonians were still looking for communication devices, not escaped prisoners. They reached a junction where 3 other Keleth workers waited. One of them was named Pix, Zix's sister. She handed Jake a guard's uniform they had stolen from the laundry. It was too large, but it would help him move around. Jake put it on quickly and pulled the helmet low over his face. From a distance, he might pass as a Zarkonian soldier. Their first objective was the detention block. Jake needed to free the other prisoners. More people meant more fighters and more confusion for the guards. They took a service elevator down 3 levels. The detention block was less guarded than expected. Most security forces had been pulled away to deal with the supposed threat in engineering. 2 guards stood at the detention entrance. Jake walked toward them confidently, acting like he belonged there. The guards looked at him but did not raise their weapons. He got within striking distance before they realized something was wrong. Jake moved fast. His fist connected with the first guard's throat. The alien gasped and fell. The second guard tried to raise his weapon, but Zix hit him from behind with a heavy tool. They dragged the unconscious guards inside and secured their weapons. Jake now had a real gun, a Zarkonian plasma rifle. He checked the charge. Full power. Good. He moved down the corridor, releasing every prisoner he found. Most were too weak to fight, but some could move. Among them was Kyle, a warrior from the Dracon species captured months ago. Kyle was huge, nearly 7 feet tall with scales covering his body. Despite his captivity, he still looked dangerous. Jake handed him one of the captured weapons. Kyle grinned, showing sharp teeth. He had been waiting for this chance. The Zarkonians had killed his crew and destroyed his ship. He wanted revenge. More prisoners joined them. Some took weapons from a storage locker Jake found. Others just grabbed tools or metal pipes, anything that could be used as a weapon. They were a ragged group, but they had one advantage. The Zarkonians had no idea this was happening. Surprise was on their side. Jake led them toward the engineering section. That was where the real power lay. If they controlled engineering, they controlled the ship. They moved in groups using maintenance corridors and service tunnels. Keleth workers throughout the ship provided updates through hidden communicators. Security forces were still concentrated in the wrong sections. They encountered their first real resistance near a main corridor. 6 Zarkonian soldiers spotted them and opened fire. Jake dove behind a bulkhead as plasma bolts scorched the air. Kyle roared and charged forward, his scales absorbing several hits. He crashed into the soldiers like a battering ram. Jake and the others provided covering fire. The fight was brutal but short. The Zarkonians were trained soldiers, but they had never fought desperate prisoners before. Jake's group fought with nothing to lose. When it was over, 3 of Jake's people were wounded, but all 6 guards were down. They took the guards' weapons and equipment, growing stronger with each encounter. Alarms throughout the ship changed tone. Now the Zarkonians knew about the escape. Security forces began moving toward the detention block, but they were too late. Jake's group was already approaching engineering. Zix guided them through a maintenance shaft that came out right inside the engineering bay. They emerged inside a massive room filled with machinery and control stations. A dozen Zarkonian engineers worked at their posts. They looked up in shock as armed prisoners poured out of the maintenance shaft. Jake shouted for them to surrender. Most dropped their tools and raised their hands. A few tried to fight and were quickly overwhelmed. Jake moved to the main control station. His engineering knowledge came flooding back. The systems were different from human designs, but the basic principles were the same: power generation, distribution, life support. He could work with this. He began locking out control systems, preventing the Zarkonians from shutting down life support or overloading the reactor. Kyle set up defensive positions at the entrance. More fighters joined them as word spread through the ship. Keleth workers abandoned their posts and came to engineering. Other subjugated species followed. What started as an escape had become a full rebellion. Hundreds of workers throughout the ship were now actively fighting against their oppressors. Vexillar's voice came over the ship-wide communication system. All workers were ordered to return to their posts immediately. Failure to comply would result in execution. But the threat rang hollow. The workers had lived under threats their entire lives. Fear had kept them in line, but fear only worked when people believed they had no choice. Jake had shown them a choice. Jake accessed the ship's communication system and broadcast his own message. He identified himself and explained that the detention block and engineering were now under prisoner control. He called for all subjugated species to rise up. This was their chance for freedom. The Zarkonians were few, and together the workers were many. They could take back their lives. The response was overwhelming. Throughout the ship, workers began sabotaging systems and attacking guards. Decades of resentment exploded into violence. The Zarkonians tried to respond, but they were spread too thin. They had relied on fear and superior weapons. They had never prepared for a coordinated uprising of this scale. Zarkonian security forces attempted to retake engineering. They came in force, a full squad of their best soldiers. Kyle led the defense, positioning fighters at choke points. The battle raged for an hour. Plasma fire filled the corridors. Several of Jake's people fell, but they held their ground. The Zarkonians were pushed back with heavy losses. Jake used the lull in fighting to broadcast another message. This one went to the Zarkonian crew. He offered them a choice: surrender and be treated fairly, or continue fighting and face certain death. The ship was lost. Their empire was crumbling. They could die for a lost cause, or they could live to see their families again. Some Zarkonian soldiers started surrendering. Not many at first, but enough to weaken the defense. Others saw their comrades giving up and lost their will to fight. The psychological effect was devastating. The myth of Zarkonian invincibility shattered. They were not superior beings. They were just soldiers, and they were losing. Vexlar made a final stand on the bridge with his most loyal officers. Jake led the assault personally, with Kyle and 50 fighters behind him. They breached the bridge using a maintenance tunnel. The fight was desperate in close quarters. When it ended, Vexlar stood alone, surrounded by weapons pointed at his head. The commander slowly raised his hands in surrender. Jake stepped forward and removed Vexlar's weapon. The ship was theirs. The eternal dominance, pride of the Zarkonian fleet was now under the control of the prisoners it had once held. Jake stood on the bridge, breathing hard, and looked at the faces around him. They had done the impossible. They had won. The captured Zarkonians were moved to the same detention cells they had used to imprison others. Commander Vexlar found himself in the very cell where Jake had been held. The irony was not lost on anyone. Kyle and several others argued that the Zarkonians should be treated the same way they had treated their prisoners. Pain for pain, suffering for suffering, Jake refused. He gathered all the freed prisoners and explained something called the Geneva Conventions. These were rules humans had created about how to treat prisoners during war. Even enemies deserved basic dignity: food, water, medical care, and protection from torture. Many looked at him like he was crazy. After everything the Zarkonians had done, why show them mercy? Because that is what separates us from them, Jake said. We are better than they are. We do not win by becoming monsters ourselves. We win by proving that strength and cruelty are not the same thing. Some still disagreed, but they followed Jake's lead. He had gotten them this far. They would trust him a bit longer. The Zarkonian prisoners received adequate food and medical treatment. Those who were injured got care. No one was tortured or abused. The guards were told to treat them with basic respect. The captured Zarkonians could not understand this. Their entire culture was built on the idea that the strong dominated the weak. Mercy was weakness. But here were their former victims showing them kindness. Jake visited Vexlar in the detention cell. The commander sat on the floor, looking smaller than before. His uniform was dirty and torn. His eyes, once so cold and confident, now showed confusion and something that might have been shame. Jake sat outside the force field and spoke quietly. He asked Vexlar questions about the Dominion, about their military strength, about their politics. At first, Vexlar refused to answer. But as days passed and Jake continued to visit, the commander began to talk. He spoke about how the Dominion was fracturing. Resources were running low. Too many conquered worlds required too many soldiers to control. Rebellions had been growing for years, but the High Command refused to acknowledge the problem. They believed fear would always be enough. Jake listened carefully and used the information to plan his next moves. He accessed the ship's long-range communication system and sent a message to Earth. He explained what had happened and provided his location. He also sent messages to other systems, broadcasting what they had achieved. One ship full of prisoners had defeated an entire Zarkonian crew. The Empire was not invincible. The message reached dozens of worlds. On planets under Zarkonian control, resistance groups that had been hiding suddenly found courage. Small acts of sabotage became larger operations. Workers began refusing orders. Soldiers found their supply lines disrupted. The uprising on the Eternal Dominance became a symbol. If prisoners on one ship could win, maybe others could too. The Zarkonian fleet surrounding the Eternal Dominance faced a difficult decision. They could attack and destroy the ship, but that would mean killing their own high-ranking officers, including Vexillar. It would also prove that the Dominion abandoned its own people, which would destroy morale across the entire military. But if they negotiated, they would appear weak. Jake forced their hand by broadcasting another message. He showed the captured Zarkonian officers being treated well. They had food, medical care, and decent living conditions. He explained that all prisoners would be released unharmed if the fleet withdrew. But if they attacked, Jake would fight to the last person. The choice was theirs. The Zarkonian fleet did nothing. They maintained their distance but did not attack. Days passed, then a week. The High Command was paralyzed by indecision. Every choice had terrible consequences. Meanwhile, rebellions continued spreading across their empire. Worlds that had been conquered decades ago were declaring independence. The Dominion was collapsing. A human fleet arrived 3 weeks after Jake's first message. Admiral Ben Cooper commanded 6 warships and 2 support vessels. It was not a huge force, but it was enough to change the balance. The Zarkonian fleet withdrew rather than face a fight. They had lost too much already. The Eternal Dominance was now under human protection. Admiral Cooper boarded the ship and met with Jake. The Admiral was impressed by what had been accomplished. The rescue mission had turned into something much bigger. Jake had not just escaped. He had sparked a revolution. Intelligence reports showed at least 20 worlds in active rebellion against the Dominion. The Empire was finished even if they did not know it yet. Jake, Zix, Kyle, and representatives from other freed species formed a provisional government aboard the ship. They called it the Free Alliance. Each species had a voice. Decisions were made together, not imposed by force. It was messy and slow, but it was fair. The ship itself became a symbol of what cooperation could achieve. Admiral Cooper offered Jake a promotion to captain and command of human forces in the sector. Jake declined. He was an engineer, not a military leader. He had done what was necessary to survive and help others. But now it was time to let people who were better suited take charge. He recommended Kyle for the military position. The Draken warrior had tactical skills and the respect of fighters from many species. What Jake wanted most was to go home. He wanted to see Sophie again. He wanted to hold Katie and tell her about the stars. He wanted to sleep in his own bed and eat food that actually tasted good. The Admiral understood and arranged transport back to Earth. Jake would leave within a week. Before departing, Jake visited Vexillar one last time. The commander had changed during his imprisonment. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something like understanding. Vexillar asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. How could humans be so strong yet so merciful? How could they endure so much pain but choose not to inflict it on others? Jake thought about this for a moment before answering. Humans know what suffering feels like, he said. We have caused it and experienced it throughout our history. We learned that strength without compassion is just cruelty. Real power comes from choosing to be kind even when you could be cruel. We are strong because we survived a harsh world. We are merciful because we decided that survival was not enough. We wanted to be better. Vexillar asked what would happen to him. Jake explained that he would face trial for his crimes. But it would be a fair trial with rules and evidence. He would have a chance to defend himself. If found guilty, his punishment would be imprisonment, not torture. And eventually, if he showed genuine change, there might even be a chance for redemption. Justice, not vengeance. The commander sat quietly for a long time. Then he said something that surprised Jake. He thanked him, not for the capture, but for the lesson. The Zarkonians had built their empire on fear because they knew nothing else. But maybe there was a different way. Maybe they could learn from their mistakes and build something better. It would take time, but the seed had been planted. Jake left the detention cell and walked through the ship. Everywhere he looked, he saw people from different species working together. Kaleth engineers trained humans on Zarkonian technology. Draken warriors taught combat techniques to former prisoners. Everyone had a role. Everyone had value. This was what the galaxy could be if fear was replaced with cooperation. On his last day aboard the Eternal Dominance, The crew gathered to say goodbye. Zix gave him a small crystal from the Keleth homeworld. Kyle performed a Drake and Warrior blessing. Others from various species offered gifts and thanks. Jake felt embarrassed by the attention. He had just done what anyone would do. But they told him no, not anyone. Only someone with true strength and true compassion. Jake boarded the transport ship that would take him home. As the vessel pulled away, he looked back at the Eternal Dominance. It now flew a new flag, one representing the Free Alliance. What had started as a nightmare had become something hopeful. The aliens who tried to break one human prisoner had discovered that humanity could not be broken. And in trying to chain humans, they had ended up in chains themselves. The journey home took 2 weeks. Jake spent most of it sleeping and recovering. His body still showed scars from the torture, but his mind was clear. He had survived. More than that, he had won, not through cruelty or superior weapons, but through determination, intelligence, and refusing to become the monster his enemies wanted him to be. Earth appeared on the viewport like a blue jewel against the darkness of space. Jake felt his throat tighten as he saw his homeworld for the first time in over a year. The transport descended through the atmosphere, and he watched clouds pass by outside. Everything looked exactly as he remembered, yet somehow different. Or maybe he was the one who had changed. The ship landed at a military base in Colorado. Jake stepped out onto solid ground and breathed earth air. It smelled like pine trees and rain. Simple things he had taken for granted before his capture now felt precious. He stood there for a moment, just breathing and feeling the gentle wind on his face. A ceremony had been planned, but Jake asked them to delay it. There was only one place he wanted to be. An hour later, a car dropped him off in front of a small house in a quiet neighborhood. His house, his home. Jake walked up the driveway slowly, his heart pounding harder than it had during the rebellion. The front door opened before he reached it. Sophie stood there, her hand over her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. Behind her, Katie peeked out, looking confused and curious. Jake ran the last few steps and pulled Sophie into his arms. She was real. She was here. He buried his face in her hair and let himself cry for the first time since his capture. Katie tugged at his leg. She had gotten taller. Her 8th birthday had come and gone without him. Jake knelt down and looked at his daughter. She studied his face carefully as if making sure he was really her father. Then she smiled and threw her arms around his neck. "Daddy," she said simply. Jake held her tight and promised he would never leave again. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he remembered. The same furniture, the same photos on the walls, even the same coffee mug he had used the morning he left for the mission. Normal life had continued here while he was surviving in darkness. The contrast was almost overwhelming. He sat on the couch between Sophie and Katie and just held them both. They talked for hours. Sophie told him about the months of not knowing if he was alive. The military had listed him as missing in action after the frontier's edge was destroyed. Some crew members made it home in escape pods, but no one knew what happened to Jake. She had refused to give up hope, even when others suggested he was probably dead. Jake told them a simplified version of his story. He left out the worst parts of the torture and the violence of the uprising. Katie did not need to hear those details. But he told them about the friends he made, about Zix and the Keleth who risked everything to help him, about Kyle and the other prisoners who fought for their freedom, about choosing to show mercy even when revenge would have been easier. The news networks wanted interviews. The military wanted him for debriefings. Politicians wanted to use his story for their own purposes. Jake refused them all for now. He had given enough of himself to duty and service. For the next few weeks, he belonged to his family. The rest of the world could wait, but the galaxy did not wait. Reports came in daily about the collapse of the Zarkonian Dominion. More worlds declared independence every week. The Free Alliance grew as liberated species joined together for mutual protection and cooperation. What had started on one ship was becoming a major shift in galactic politics. Humanity found itself at the center of it all, respected as liberators rather than feared as conquerors. Zix sent a message through the human diplomatic channels. The Keleth people wanted to formally thank Jake for his role in their liberation. Their homeworld was preparing for its first free elections in 50 years. They invited him to attend as an honored guest. Jake sent back his congratulations but declined the invitation. He was happy for them, but his traveling days were over for now. Kyle also reached out. The Dracon warrior had been appointed as the military commander of the Free Alliance forces. He was coordinating with human military leaders to help more worlds break free from oppression. Kyle said that every victory was dedicated to Jake, the human who proved that determination could overcome any obstacle. Jake felt proud but also humble. He had just been trying to survive. Months passed. Jake slowly readjusted to normal life. He took a job teaching engineering at a university. The work was simple compared to what he had been through, but that was exactly what he wanted. He taught students about ship design and power systems. Sometimes he told stories about space, carefully edited versions that emphasized problem-solving and teamwork. Katie started asking more questions as she got older. She wanted to know about aliens and other worlds. Jake showed her pictures that Zix had sent, images of the Keleth homeworld with its purple skies and 3 moons. He told her about the different species in the Free Alliance, about their cultures and their dreams. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders. One night, Sophie asked him if he regretted anything. Jake thought about the question carefully. He regretted the people who died during the uprising. He regretted the pain he had endured, but he did not regret the choices he made. Every decision had been made to protect others and to prove that humanity stood for something better than cruelty and domination. The scars on his body faded slowly. The scars in his mind took longer. Sometimes he still woke up thinking he was back in that cell. Sometimes he heard alarms and his body tensed, ready for a fight. But Sophie was always there to remind him he was home. Katie's laughter pulled him back to reality. Slowly, the nightmares became less frequent. A year after his return, the human government finally convinced him to accept a medal. The ceremony was small, held at the same base where he had landed. Admiral Cooper presented him with the Star of Valor, the highest military honor. Jake accepted it not for himself, but for everyone who had fought on the Eternal Dominance. They were the real heroes. During his speech, Jake spoke about what he had learned. Humanity's greatest strength was not our technology or our weapons. It was our refusal to let circumstances define us. We could endure terrible things without becoming terrible ourselves. We could be strong without being cruel. We could fight when necessary but choose peace when possible. That was what made humans special. The galaxy was changing because of what happened on that ship. The Free Alliance was growing into a real power, built on cooperation instead of conquest. Former enemies were becoming partners. Species that had never trusted each other were learning to work together. It was messy and imperfect, but it was progress. News reached Earth that Vexillar had been tried and sentenced. The Zarkonian commander would spend 20 years in a rehabilitation facility, not a torture chamber. He would receive education about other cultures and counseling for his actions. Some said it was too lenient. Others said it was too harsh. Jake thought it was exactly right. Justice meant giving people a chance to change, not just punishing them forever. Years passed. Katie grew into a teenager with dreams of exploring space herself. She wanted to be a diplomat, helping different species understand each other. Jake supported her dream while hoping she would never have to face what he had faced. But he also knew that the galaxy was safer now, because people had been willing to stand up against tyranny. One evening, Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset. Sophie brought him coffee and sat beside him. They watched the sky turn orange and purple as Earth's sun dipped below the horizon. Somewhere up there among those stars, the Free Alliance was holding its annual meeting. Humans, Keleth, Dracon, and dozens of other species working together to build something better. Jake thought about the journey that brought him here. The capture, the torture, the escape, the rebellion. It had been the hardest experience of his life. But it had also shown him what humans were truly capable of. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just enduring pain, but transforming it into something meaningful. Not just fighting enemies, but turning them into allies. The aliens had tried to break a human prisoner. They had used every tool at their disposal, every technique refined over centuries of conquest. But they had failed to understand one simple truth. Humans cannot be broken because breaking requires taking everything away. And the one thing no one could take from Jake was his choice. His choice to endure. His choice to resist. His choice to remain human even in the darkest moments. Now those aliens who tried to chain him were the ones bound by the consequences of their actions. Not through revenge, but through justice. Not through hatred, but through understanding. The tables had turned completely. The prisoner had become the liberator. The tortured had shown mercy to the torturer. The weak had proven to be strong all along. Sophie squeezed his hand gently. Katie called from inside that dinner was ready. Jake stood up and walked toward his family, toward his home, toward his life. The stars would always be there, full of wonders and dangers. But for now, everything he needed was right here. And that was enough.